Well, welcome everyone, Faroese, Shetlander and other, to this, the first Faroes Shetland Research Symposium. I'm Andrew Jennings, the Associate Professor of Island Studies with the Institute for Northern Studies, UHI, based at UHI Shetland. And this is an event that a small group of colleagues in the Faroe Islands and Shetland have been preparing for a while. And our small group includes Faroes Guiney and Erica Hayfield from the Faroe Shetland and myself, Simon Clark and John Goodlad, representing the Institute for Northern Studies and UHI Shetland. We're also branding this symposium under the UHI Islands Matter umbrella. Now, just a few words about the reason we're doing this. The rationale for the symposium is the desire to reconnect researchers across the sea and to share our current research and, of course, to learn from each other. After all, we live on small, similar-sized rocks in the North Atlantic, and we have a shared cultural heritage, even if at times that's obscured by later historical events. Over the centuries, the two island groups have kept an occasional eye on each other. In the 19th century, Jakob Jakobsen and Christian Pluyen were interested in what was going on here in Shetland, and in Jakobsen's case, providing Shetlanders with a vital text, the etymological dictionary of the Norn language in Shetland, which sits on many a Shetland bookshelf, including my own. And in the present day, of course, more and more Shetlanders are fascinated by the vibrancy and get up and go attitude of the Faroese, looking in awe at Faroese autonomy, undersea tunnels, and an increasing population. And many are saying, we'd like a bit of that too, please. We're sure that this is going to be the beginning of a fruitful new era of research connections between our islands. And we hope, that's Faroes, Erica, John, Simon, and myself, that this will be the start of something transformational for our two universities and for the first of many research symposia exploring a wide range of different disciplines and research activities. Today, we're going to be focusing on the humanities, so archaeology, history, and culture. And in fact, we'll be continuing in the footsteps of some excellent previous researchers. For example, those who contributed to the Faroe Skaparit Volume 13 from 1964, which had papers by T.M. Y. Manson on the personal impact of Jakobsen in Shetland and Orkney, Björn Hagström on the Husavik and Svala Solheim, who explored Jakob Jakobsen's Folkkommunitexter på Norn. The Faroe Skaparit is full of many goodies and is available online, and many of the articles are in English, so I definitely recommend that. So today we're going to have 10-minute talks from our speakers, and then there will be 5 minutes after each speaker for questions, and you can post them in the chat. So we'll be looking at that. I'll be keeping a beady eye, but so will our other members of this group. And at the end of the talks, there will be more opportunity for specific questions and for more general ones. For example, how do we increase research collaboration, or how does research funding compare between our two institutions? That kind of thing. Now, this symposium is not only showcasing some of the fascinating research that's been undertaken, it's also about looking forward to new fields of research and to how we might develop joint research projects in future. So we want this to be an awareness-raising event, but also we want to see if we can come up with recommendations about how we can take things forward for our mutual benefit and bring our islands closer together. So we'll spend the final hour discussing these questions and any others that the panelists or you attendees out there want to bring up. Each speaker will begin by telling us briefly who they are and their research interests, and then they'll give us a taste of that research. And before we call the first one up, I don't know if Faroes from the Faroe Islands, if you'd like to say something.
Andrew, I think you had an excellent presentation of this this venture, this collaboration. So I'm not going to say much more, except that I'm very happy to be here, and I'm glad that we are now launching the first seminar, hopefully in a long row of seminars, including Shetland Faroe Islands collaboration. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Faroes. Okay, well, let's get started. We have some really interesting talks in front of us. And let's start with Viveka, Viveka Velupillai. Hello, Viveka. Would you like to kick us off, as it were?
Right, yes, and I'll be sharing slides. I'll start sharing now. Right, can you all see my start screen?
Yes, we can.
Good. So I'm a linguist. I'll be telling you about my various linguistic hats in the next slide, but this is about how Shetland fits the profile for a typical one type of contact language. I'm affiliated with the Justus Liebig University in Gießen, as you can see, but I'm based in Shetland, and I do teach yearly, but I teach from here by video. So one of the few silver linings of that horrible pandemic has made it possible to do that. So I'm permanently based here, even though I am affiliated there. Now, my linguistic hats are, I'm a typologist. I work with linguistic typology, which essentially studies the structural differences and similarities between languages of the world. So our core, in the nutshell, question is what's, where, why? What kinds of structures do we find? How do they pattern? Where do we find them? How do they pattern? And why do we see such patternings? That's essentially what we look at. So we look at global patterns, and for that we need detailed descriptions of as many languages as possible. And so we engage in that on a very intensive scale. In order to have huge data, as big a database as possible for as much as possible. I'm also a contact linguist, which means that I study situations where speakers of different languages interact and how these contact situations affect the languages involved. And this means not sporadic meetings between speakers of different languages, but sustained contact situations where speakers of different languages, the same kinds of different languages, that they meet repeatedly, and how that then affect the languages involved. And I'm a historical linguist, which means that I study how and why languages change over time, what kinds of changes we see, and how can we see that kind of change. There is a typology to all of this. There are global patterns to all of this. We see certain kinds of global patterns when it comes to contact situations, and we see certain kinds of global patterns when it comes to how languages change over time. Grammaticalization is the process that we refer to there. So to give you a very, very simplified definition of what a contact language is, as opposed to a high contact language with capital C and L, a type of language. Now, a contact language has emerged because of language contact. In other words, it has more than one predominant ancestor. Now, every language is unique and every situation is unique, and there is no known human language that hasn't been affected by some other human language somehow. But the grade of the range of affection can be violently different. You know, very, very large spectrum of kinds of contact here. And contact languages are those that actually emerge through a contact situation. It leads to a new type of language when these more than one main ancestor, when they meet intensively and a new language is formed. The other kind that that is often confused with this type of language is a high contact language. Now, this is a language that has undergone a lot of contact, but it hasn't emerged because of a given contact situation. So in other words, we still only have one main ancestor, but there's been influence from other languages to varying degrees. So examples of contact languages that emerged because of this contact situation, a given contact situation, is Rustennorsk, which is a type of pidgin, and Jamaican, which is a type of Creole, and Michif, which is a type of mixed language. These are three different types of contact languages. Examples of high contact languages that have one main ancestor but have undergone a lot of contact and been influenced by other languages are, for instance, French, where the ultimate ancestor is Vulgar Latin, but there's been a lot of contact with Germanic, and that has affected the language. Persian has its main ancestor as Old Persian, which ultimately came from the Iranian branch of Proto-Indo-European, but it's had a lot of contact with, throughout history, with the Arabic, the Turkic, the Russian, the French, and the English world, and that has affected the language, but it still has a traceable main ancestor. And English has a traceable main ancestor in Mercian Old English, but it's had a lot of contact with Old Norse, Norman French, Latin, and later French, and so on. So that has affected the language, but the structure and the ancestry is still identifiably Old English, one type of Old English. There were 4 Old Englishes. We should keep that in mind. Now, there are 4 major types of contact languages, and this is important because this tends to be confused outside contact linguistics. A jargon is unstructured, that is, you can't really write a grammar. It's reinvented in every situation, whereas Pidgins, Creoles, and mixed languages are structured. They have predictable structures that you can actually put down in a grammar. Jargons and Pidgins are auxiliary languages. That is, all those who use jargons and Pidgins have some other mother tongue. But Creoles and mixed languages are mother tongues. They might have several mother tongues, but Creoles and mixed languages are mother tongues to entire communities. Jargons, Pidgins, and Creoles all have a very dynamic input. There's always a flux. There's always a movement in the demographics when it comes to these communities and the situations and the formations of them. Both Pidgins and Creoles are associated with the plantation situation, where you had a constant stream of new arrivals and new languages that entered the mix and so on. Whereas mixed languages have a stable input. It is for a long time the same 2 or 3 languages that are spoken alongside each other and that form a contact situation, and very often in a bilingual situation. So in other words, for jargons, Pidgins, and Creoles, we have a dynamic linguistic ecology, linguistic environment, whereas for mixed languages, we have a very stable, comparatively stable ecology. And that also means that while jargons, Pidgins, and Creoles have this fluctuating multilingual situation, the mixed language, typical mixed language situation is one of stable bilingualism. And I stress again, this is simplified. Every single language and situation is unique in the world. So these are all obviously simplified terminological toolboxes. When it comes to Pidgins and Creoles, we know roughly where the main input for the vocabulary is, and we tend to call the Creoles after that, and the Pidgins too. We'll say, for instance, we used to, it's starting to change, but we might have said Jamaican English or Jamaican Creole English, indicating that the main source of the lexicon is English. But for the other structures, all the other structures, the phonology and the grammar, that's fairly opaque. For mixed languages, however, it is fairly straightforward, although nothing in linguistics is ever straightforward, but it is fairly identifiable where we have the structures from. We can quite often say that the majority of the lexicon is from this language and the majority of the grammar is from that language, or the majority of the verbal system is from this language and the majority of the nominal system is from that language, and so on. For both Creoles and mixed languages being mother tongues, they also represent community identity markers. There's a very, very important function of the languages. And for mixed languages, it's very often used as in-group communication, so that a number of mixed languages that have been identified typologically were around for very long, but were only used in within certain groups, in in-group situations, so that as soon as someone from the outside was present, the language wouldn't be used. It was an in-group marker. And in fact, the first language that was identified as a mixed language was identified by eavesdropping. My supervisor identified media lengua in Ecuador by realizing that when they thought he wasn't hearing or listening, they switched to a different language from Quechua, and he started to see the structural differences, and that really kicked off the global research on mixed languages. But obviously they've been around for much longer than that. It just means that they weren't identified until the 80s as a special type. Now, my project here has been to document and describe Shetland. There's obviously within these 10 minutes no time to summarize this nearly, well, actually past 8-year project. It's all summarized on our site here, iheardi.com. Pretty much all our output is available there. But very short, Shetland has 2 main ancestors, Norn and Scots, in chronological order. Norn was here first, and then Scots moved in. But there's also been a lot of contact because of trade with the Low Country Germanic languages, especially Middle Dutch and Middle Low German. They were quite closely related. They're still very closely related. At the time, they tended to be lumped together under the flag of just Dutch. They were referred to as Dutch, but it could have been any of those varieties that were spoken in the Low Country Germanic area now. It's essentially the harbor regions, the Hansa regions of Northern Europe, Northern continental Europe. But for the last 200 years or so, English has been considered or been taught to be the proper language. It's English that has been what we call the high language, the language of education and administration, and generally in formal situation. English has been the language that has been used, and Shetland has been fairly stigmatized and is what we call the low language that is used in intimate situations and familiar situations, and was not welcome in schools and certainly not in any other formal functions. Now, because so I'm rushing through here, but we can speak more, and I can send around that article if you like, Andrew. Because Shetland is usually compared to English, even though English is not the ancestor of Shetland, it's Scots, which is not a dialect of English any more than English is a dialect of Scots. They come from 2 different branches of Old English. Because Shetland tends to be compared to English as a kind of a quirky version of English, or at best, or a rude version of English. Once I had a body of data, I compared Shetland with Standard English, the usual comparandum. So you're going to see 2 graphs that essentially summarizes these 8 years of research. And the first one is this grammatical comparison, where we then took, because English is one of the languages that it gets compared to, we took Swedish as the Scandinavian balancer, because Swedish is not the ancestor of Shetland. It's as far removed from the ancestor Norn as English is from the ancestor Scots. So genetically, these 3 languages are balanced, equally distant. So we took the standard grammar of spoken and written English, Biber et al., for the main features of English grammar there, and the equivalent standard grammar for Swedish, and compared the main features between them. And for Shetland, we took our own grammar and included them as features. We weighted it in the following manner. If these are obviously very closely related languages. They're all Germanic. Now, when they had the same feature, that was weighted with 1. So everyone has the same word order here. If they had similar features that were not identical, then that was weighted with 0.5. And if they didn't overlap at all, then that was weighted with 0. So an example of a similar but not the same feature would be that all 3 languages have weak and strong verbs, but which verb is weak and which is strong, that differs. So it's similar but not the same. And an example of something that, for instance, Shetland has, but English does not, is the associative plural, or to have a difference between do and you. That would then be weighted as 0. And so we put this through a cluster dendrogram. Linguistics has, for the last couple of decades, stolen algorithms from biogenetics in order to show connections between languages. And we put it through this cluster dendrogram that shows family relationships. This is then bootstrapped 10,000 times, which means that the computer tests it 10,000 times in all possible combinations, and only comes out with a graph if there is some kind of significance to it, as in statistical significance. So here's the graph. What we see here between these 3 genetically balanced languages is that English is the outlier. English splits off first. The vertical position is also significant here. So English splits off at 3.5. They're all very low because they're all closely related, but English splits off first. And then Swedish and Shetland only splits off very far down, nearly at 0. If there hadn't been any difference, there wouldn't have been a split, but obviously there is a difference because every variety has its unique, at least one unique feature, and obviously there'll be many more between Swedish and Shetland. So what we see here is that the grammar is Scandinavian in its structure. But if we then compare the lexicon, and what we did here was to compare the Swedish lists, because the Swedish lists are postulated to be the 100 most common words in any given language. There's a 100 list and a 200 list, which means that the likelihood that you'll find these 100 words in any given language is extremely high. This is a method that is by now 15 years old. I was part of a big project called the Automated Similarity Judgment Program, where we took Swedish lists for as many languages as we could. I personally coded about, well, slightly over 1,000 languages, and put it through, again, a stolen algorithm from biogenetics, what's called phylogenetic trees. And the algorithm shows the relationships. It shows the splits, but it also shows cross-influence. So what we did here was we took, obviously, Shetland, then we took Scots as the ancestor, but we don't have Norn available, so we took the 2 Norwegians to represent that ancestry. But because Shetland has been under such pressure from English for so long, we also took English, which meant that we balanced that with Swedish. And for the sake of representing the contact varieties, the Low Country Germanic contact varieties, we also took Dutch. And this is what we get. This is again bootstrapped 10,000 times. That's the standard to do that. What we see here is that Shetland is more different from Scots and English than Swedish is from the 2 Norwegians. So Swedish has got a much shorter branch and is much closer clustered together with the 2 Norwegians. And obviously the 2 Norwegians are extremely close, but not identical. What we also see is that Scots and English are closer to each other than Shetland is to either Scots or English. So that's the contact, that's first of all, the substratum that leads to that, the Scandinavian substratum, but also the contact with Dutch, which has led to that. Dutch obviously splits off from all of them and is on its own branch. Again, I have to stress, it's obvious these are very closely related languages. If we'd put in Turkish here, it would have had a completely different branch sitting way away from the others. And the third thing that we see is that Scots and English show more influence between each other. That's this little box. See if you can see my cursor. This little box here, that shows cross influence. Usually that indicates contact influence, so that we see the two Norwegians have a box between them. And this box here between Scots and English is much larger than any of them have with Shetland. So in a nutshell, this is what we see. The lexicon is predominantly Anglian, but distinct. The branch is quite distinct, and the grammar is predominantly Scandinavian. So could Shetland qualify as a contact language? Well, Shetland is certainly structured, but so are also Pidgins, Creoles, and mixed languages. Shetland is a mother tongue. Pidgins are not, so it certainly isn't a Pidgin. We knew that. Creoles are mother tongues, as are mixed languages. But Shetland had a stable input of these few languages, predominantly Scots and Norn, with contact from the Low Country Germanic languages. It was a stable ecology, and it was mainly a stable bilingualism. We also have identifiable, as far as these things go, fairly identifiable sources for the structures of this language. And it is a community identity marker. Now, the only thing that overlaps between Creoles here is the community identity marker bit, but the rest doesn't work, so it doesn't qualify as a Creole, and this is no surprise to us. But it does fit the profile of a mixed language. From all the other mixed languages that we know in the world, this is very, very similar. So could we think of Shetland as a mixed language? It's not impossible. In fact, it is a prototypical GL language. The grammar, the G here, comes from the original settlers, the Scandinavian component, and the lexicon, the L in the GL language, comes from the new settlers, the Anglians. This actually fits the typical model that Peter Bakker launched in, well, he's been working on it for many decades, but his 2017 model postulates exactly this, that when it comes to GL languages, we can expect, I mean, more often than not, we'll see the grammar from the original settlers and the lexicon from the new settlers. So in fact, Shetland is now actually used as a case study for a typical GL language, from Boston and North Carolina to Hong Kong, and from Helsinki and Uppsala down to South Africa. Students are learning about Shetland as a GL mixed language, and it's
That's
very
great news, Vivica. Fantastic. Could you
am I over the time?
Just
Sorry.
a little bit, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I did just want to mention that we have a very similar mixed language in the Netherlands called Bilts, where the grammar is Frisian, the original settlers, and the lexicon is Dutch. That's the new settlers. So I apologize for speaking too much, but thank you for
Thank you
holding
very
up.
much. No need to apologise. It was all fascinating stuff. So lots of food for thought there. It's just we want to make sure everyone else has a chance to also speak. But that's great. Thank you. And it's great to see how that research that you've been doing has progressed, and that, you know, we can justifiably claim Shetland as a contact language. So thank you very much indeed. If you have questions for Vivica, you can stick them in the chat. Nobody's put anything there yet. Maybe you're holding off until afterwards. And I think we will just move on to the next speaker just now. But if you do have some questions for Vivica, please post them. So we're keeping in a sort of linguistic field now. So I'd like to introduce Mark Smith, who's going to talk about Jacob Jakobsen's sister, Anna Horsbull. I can't pronounce it in Danish anymore. Horsbull.
Thank you, Andrew. Can everybody hear me okay?
We certainly can.
Good. As Andrew said, my name is Mark Smith, and I work here at the Shetland Archives. And my main area of research has been literary history in Shetland. But I'm going to speak about something else today. Before I get into the subject, I wanted to say that I'm very happy to be here at the event today. It's really good to see a new Shetland Faroe initiative get going. I mean, from Christian ploughing in the 1830s to dozens of island football players in the 20th century, Faroe and Shetland have seen working together as a worthwhile thing to do. So hopefully this symposium is the first of many similar events that will be held in the future. In future symposia, I would like to explore the literatures that have come from both archipelagos, because I think there are good opportunities for comparison and discussion between the writing of the two places. We might look, for instance, at the relationship that poets and novelists have with local and national languages and the politics around that. Or we might discuss the challenges of being a creative artist in a remote sort of place distant from centres of publishing and culture and learning and so on. But that's for future events, I think. But today, in the spirit of kind of Faroe Shetland collaboration, I wanted to look at a Faroese woman who worked with a number of Shetlanders to produce what for Shetland is a very important, even as Andrew said at the beginning, an iconic piece of work. This woman was called Anna Horsbull. Anna Horsbull was the sister of Jacob Jakobsen. And as Andrew said at the beginning, Jakobsen's story is very well known. But his sister Anna, even though, as I'm going to say, she played a major part in making his work available to a wider audience, is relatively unheralded. As we'll see, Anna was extremely intelligent, she was very determined and very capable, and these are virtues she employed when she produced English translations of Jakobsen's Northern Dictionary and his book about Shetland place names. These books, as you probably all know, were written in Danish, and if it wasn't for Anna and the work she did, very few people in Shetland would be able to read Jakobsen's work. Anna Horsbull was born in Faroe in 1856. Like her brother, Jacob, she went to Denmark and she remained in Copenhagen for the rest of her life, where she worked as a school teacher. Being 8 years older than Jacob, she seems to have adopted a kind of motherly attitude to this research-obsessed brother of hers, and he lived with Anna and her husband in a 5-bedroom flat in Copenhagen when he wasn't on his travels. When Jacob died in 1918, Anna was devastated, and this is what she wrote to J.J. Halden Burgess, a Lerwick writer and a linguist who'd been a close friend of her brother's during his time here. She said, "Can you imagine my boundless grief at having lost my beloved brother? Never have I loved any person so much as him. I am disconsolate and sick. He was such a lovable person. I'm on the point of losing my senses and cannot sleep at night. I loved him with a divine love, both as sister and mother. I don't know how I can continue to live." Nevertheless, Anna, characteristically, she did keep going, and she dedicated the next 22 years of her life to her brother's work. By 1921, the 4 volumes of Jakobsen's dictionary had been published in Danish. And even before the last bit of that 4-volume work came out, Anna was thinking about an English translation. As it says in her preface to the eventual English translation that did appear, it had been Jakobsen's, quote, earnest wish to see this appear. And from 1920, she was writing to people in Shetland, Halden Burgess, the bookseller Thomas Matthewson, public assistance officer and linguist William Ratter about how that might be achieved. These discussions went on for a while, and they really picked up pace when Anna visited Shetland in 1921. When she was here, she went to see all her brother's old friends, and by the time she left, she was no doubt far more determined than ever to bring the project to fruition. Various translators were suggested for the dictionary: Halden Burgess, William Ratter, Hugh Marwick in Orkney, the Reverend David Houston, the Danish linguist Otto Jespersen. But for one reason or another, none of them committed to what would be a long and arduous task. Then, in 1922, William Ratter, who, despite what I'm going to read out just now, was a generous and helpful friend to Anna, he wrote this to her. William Ratter wrote, "As you say, the translation must be worthy of your brother. I do not think you could do it yourself. It is doubtful whether it would be quite satisfactory, even with your English friend to help, but I hope we shall live to see it done." Thankfully, Anna paid no attention to this and decided to take on the job of translation herself anyway. Her work on the translation started in 1922, and this is how she went about doing it. In Copenhagen, she was by then retired from teaching. Anna would translate about a dozen pages. These would then be sent to William Ratter and Halden Burgess in Lerwick, and the two men would meet on Sunday afternoons in Burgess's house at 4 Queen's Lane in Lerwick to go through them. Ratter reading aloud to Burgess, who was by that stage in his life completely blind. The two men would mark up the manuscript pages with any suggestions, and they would post the sheets back to Copenhagen. And this process went on until the summer of 1923, and it amounted by that time to around 1,300 handwritten sheets. Then, in 1923, with the translation seemingly coming along well, Anna visited Lerwick again. She spent hours reading the manuscript to Burgess, and when she left, it looked like their ambition of producing an English translation of the dictionary was coming ahead smoothly. However, on her way home, Anna stopped in Orkney, where she went to visit the teacher and scholar Hugh Marwick. Now, like Burgess and Ratter in Shetland, Marwick had spent time with Jacobsen and greatly respected the Faroese man's work. Inspired by these meetings, two of Marwick's major books are on Orkney Norn and Orcadian place names, so Jacobsen was a clear model for him. Now, Marwick was a very formidable local scholar, but he seems to have been a difficult kind of man. In a kind of a savage reminiscence, the younger Orcadian writer Ernest Marwick, the two men weren't related, they did have the same surname, but they weren't related. He said that Hugh Marwick, quote, could be extremely rude, end quote, and that some of his former pupils hated him. Clearly, Hugh Marwick wasn't a man that people tended to warm to. Now, although Hugh Marwick did in the future go on to help Anna Horswell considerably, their meeting in 1923 did not go well at all. Anna, when she was in Orkney, she showed him the work she'd been doing with Ratter and Burgess, and as she says in a letter in 1927, Marwick was not quite satisfied with what he saw. We don't know exactly what Marwick said to her, but the fact that Anna, after this meeting, scrapped almost all the work she'd done up to that point, it makes me wonder if she encountered the harsh, arrogant sort of guy that Ernest Marwick describes in his memoir of Hugh. And I suspect Anna left Orkney in much lower spirits than she did when she left Lerwick a few days earlier. But, as was the case when her brother passed away, Anna kept going. As I say, she dumped almost all the translations she'd produced over the last year and a bit, and she thought about other ways of getting the work done. She did that work by going back to the source. That was the 80 notebooks that Jakobsen compiled in English during his sort of perambulations around the Isles. Anna took the 4 Danish volumes of the dictionary and started writing Jakob's notes next to the relevant words, and this became the basis for her translation. And from autumn of 1923 to the spring of 1925, working for 16 to 18 hours a day, Anna produced the English text that we have now. She was helped by a few people, the OED editor William Craigie, Hugh Marwick, a proofreader called Miss Batho from King's College in London. But the scale of the task she undertook for a second time shouldn't be underestimated. It's a prodigious piece of scholarship, which Anna Horsball achieved despite her probable lack of philological training and the occasional discouragement of some of the men she encountered along the way. The first volume of Anna's translation was published in 1928, and the second part followed in 1932. In 1932, she visited Shetland and Orkney for the last time, and there was a piece in the Orcadian about her which said that, quote, "Few women have performed more signal service to northern peoples than Anna Horsball." And as we've seen today, despite her relative obscurity now, this claim isn't an exorbitant one at all. But I'm not so sure that she would have liked the limelight very much anyway, because when the Orcadian reporter asked her about her work on the dictionary, he found that, quote, "Of her own part in putting this valuable book before the northern public, Miss Horsball was reluctant to talk." When she got back to Denmark, Anna went on to translate Jakob's book on Shetland place names, which was published in 1936, and she started work on an English version of his doctoral thesis. This project was never finished, as Anna died in 1940 in a city that was then occupied by the Nazis. I don't know much about her last few years, or for that matter, for her early life and her family life in Faroe. So if any of our colleagues in Faroe are able to fill in some of these gaps, I would be very happy to hear from them. As I'm sure we'll hear in these sessions, Jakobsen's work is an important part of our shared history and culture in Shetland and Faroe, and he's rightly celebrated in both places. But as we've seen today, his sister probably hasn't had the credit she's due. And here in Shetland and in the English-speaking world more generally, Jakobsen would be a much more distant and a much more inaccessible figure if it wasn't for the work of Anna Horsball. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. And it's a great piece of work that you're doing, and yeah, she definitely should be given the credit that she deserves. And I suppose it's typical, isn't it, that she hasn't, but you're doing a great job in making us aware of her. Thanks very much. And it would be good to know if you know, our Faroese colleagues could enlighten us or enlighten you more about her and her life. So hopefully you can follow up on that in future. Are there any questions for Mark at the moment? Or should we move on to the next presentation? And you can keep your questions until the end. Okay. Well, I can see that our colleague in the Faroes, Erica, has joined us, so that's great to see. Welcome, Erica. We're rattling through the material so far, so it's great that you're able to join us and hear what people have to say. So we're going to the next speaker, who is Brian Smith, our inimitable archivist here in Shetland. It's great to see you, Brian. Please take it away. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, good. I was supposed to be speaking about how Shetlanders looked on Faroese, but this turned into a discussion about how Shetlanders and Faroese regard each other. There were links between Shetland and the Faroes in the Middle Ages, as we'd expect, but we don't know much about them. It isn't until the 1830s that we find Faroese people and Shetlanders fraternising and thinking about each other's societies. And even then, the dearth of transport links meant that contact didn't happen often. In 1840, Lawrence Edmonston, a Shetland doctor and naturalist, sailed to the Faroes with his son Beat. They were tourists. Around the same time, John Turnbull, a Shetland minister, was writing to the Faroese priest and folklorist Johan Hendrik Schroeter for information about the island's medieval histories. Everybody knows about Christian Ployen. He's been mentioned several times already, the Danish official from Tórshavn who came to Shetland in 1839 to investigate the fishing industry. Ployen was a clever man. I have constantly compared Shetland with Faroe, he says in the foreword to his eventual book. It gave me a certain pang, he goes on, to remember how far the Faroese fishing fails. Ployen praised Shetland, but he didn't hesitate to criticise it. It must be observed, he said, that the Shetlanders, when by their union with Scotland they got free trade, were at the same time bereft of another sort of freedom, which is of still greater importance, and thus made slaves in their own land. Now that's a good way to contrast the political economies of the two groups of island. The Faroese, poor as they were in 1839, had plenty to cherish about their own society. Soon afterwards, there was more and more contact between Shetland and Faroe when cod smacks based in Shetland began to ply between the two. Ployen's praise of the Shetland economy became well known in the north. In 1849, Thorleifur Hrepp, the Icelandic scholar, referred to Shetland in an address that he had issued for his election to the Althing. He took Ployen's argument a step further. He said that the elaborate Danish law current in Iceland and the Faroes had suppressed economic enterprise and activity in the far north. Shetland, he argued, was thriving because of its more permissive Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse laws. It's not a very convincing thesis, but it shows that Ployen had inspired the discussion. The Shetland-Faroese debate was intermittent. Despite the cod fishery that linked the two communities, it wasn't until 1893 that a Faroese scholar arrived here in Lerwick to take the argument a stage further. Jakob Jakobsen, as we've heard, wanted to collect fragments of the Shetland Northern language. He became popular in Shetland because of the courteous and respectful way in which he conducted his research. Just as Ployen had congratulated the Faroese on their humane land laws, Jakobsen pitied the Shetlanders because of the disappearance of their native language. The more I study this poor abused language, he said, and attempt to hammer the pieces back together, the stronger I sense its close relation to my own mother tongue, the stronger my love for it and my hatred for the Scots and Englishmen who have systematically suppressed its growth and health. It's the opposite of Hrepp's interpretation. It was also a sentimental argument that became popular in Shetland. It doesn't appeal to me. There's no point and no sense in regretting accidents of history unless appalling things have happened. The audiences in Lerwick who listened to Jakobsen's lectures were living in a different world from him, By that time, the herring fishing was booming in Shetland. The Shetland Faroese cod fishing was in decline, and the Shetlanders were rather well off. Now, by the late 1920s, that had changed. Shetlanders were experiencing deep economic depression. By accident, or perhaps not, there now occurred another spasm of Shetland-Faroese friendship, the most vigorous of all. In July 1928, 128 members of the Old Norse Society of Bergen, with a couple of Faroese members, arrived in Shetland. The Shetlanders welcomed them with delight and took them to the site of Shetland's medieval parliament. The whole day was an open-air event. One of the speakers was Jonas Patterson, the Faroese nationalist politician and poet. He addressed the company in Faroese. Noble
Ironically, Brian, you've just muted when you were just... Hello, Brian? Brian? Leanne? Any chance of... can you see what's happened to Brian?
I don't know, he appears to have lost incoming audio as well there.
Okay.
Brian,
Hello, Brian, can you
unmute
hear
yourself
us?
again?
Is that right?
That's
Perfect,
it,
Brian.
good. It was just as you were about to launch into the speech about what you were saying, and then it all went quiet.
Noble Shetlanders, he began, high-born kinsfolk, sons of the Vikings, nearest neighbours, we Faroe men and Shetlanders are ancient kith and kin. Jonas reminded his Shetland cousins about the island's common cod fishing history. Shetlanders, he said, first taught us deep-sea fishing in decked vessels. 3 cheers for our kinsmen, he roared. 3 cheers for the Hjaltlendingar. That wasn't the end of the Faroese Shetland rapprochement of 1928. 3 months later, Paul Nicholson, the editor of the Faroese paper De Melletting, a member of the Faroese Parliament, arrived in Shetland with a film that he'd made about his native islands. Paul had a practical idea about how to promote friendly relations between the two groups of islands. A few days later, he met members of the Shetland Football Executive Committee to propose that there should be annual matches between Faroe, Orkney and Shetland. It was a successful plan. In 1929 and 30, a Shetland team visited Faroe and the Faroese team came to Shetland. Poor conditions in the Faroese fisheries in 1932 prevented a contest that year, but in 1933, 70 Shetlanders, footballers and a troop of Boy Scouts descended on Tórshavn in the steamship Nova. There ensued a week of friendship. The Shetlanders spent hours watching a never-ending Faroese ring dance. They participated in St. Olaf's Day, watched the opening of the Lightning, went to a Lutheran church service, ate dinners, and played and watched football. At the final dinner, Paul Nicholson addressed the two communities. We know when we passed your isles, he said, that we were passing a place where words, history and place names were similar to our own. We could wish that the decrees of fate had been otherwise and that the language barrier had not arisen between us, but we are your heart friends. The Shetland headmaster, A.T. Clunas, replied, as often happens, the Shetlander was self-effacing and apologetic. We Shetlanders have, he said, become to some slight extent part and parcel of the usual kind of Britisher. The Norse element in us has to some extent disappeared, and we have lost beauty. You believe in each man taking his own line and colour. We try to be unnoticed. We have lost the artistic touch, but I think we can regain that. If our Norse ancestry has been overshadowed, it is possible for us to change our minds again and to regain some beauty of line and construction. It's a rather obscure argument. That dinner was the last moment of contact between the heart friends for a quarter of a century. In the early 60s, Shetland was still in poor economic shape. Shetland County Council sent a delegation to Faroe to examine its buoyant economy in 1962. They did a good piece of work. Tom Henderson, their leader, reflected in the report that they made about what the Shetlanders had concluded from their investigation. Since Ployan's day, he said, the fortunes of Faroe and Shetland had been completely reversed. But he was, and I quote, not prepared to admit that the Faroese are fundamentally any more energetic or hard-working than their counterparts here. He said correctly that what had happened was a chance of history. A generation or two of steady progress, he explained, bring their own reward, while a like period of recession and decline leaves its mark on any community. Tom's portrait of Shetland's and Faroese fortunes in the 1960s was as judicious as Ployan's had been in 1839. It's the way for students of the Faroes and Shetland to approach the subject, pitying Shetland because of its modern history, as Jacobsen did, or Shetlanders approaching Faroe with an inferiority complex are not useful. Nor is another attitude exemplified in a passage of arms between a Shetlander and his Faroe respondent in 1984. In that year, the high tide of Thatcherism, my old friend Danny Jimison launched a not too accurate account on Faroese culture, or on some Shetlanders' exaggerated respect for it. The Faroese accountant Sophus Olsen replied in kind. He called Jimison's piece, and I quote, a slap in the face of every Faroe man and woman, the work of someone who at the bottom of his heart is a communist. Students of Faroe and Shetland have much to learn about each other and from each other. Jacobsen's argument that Shetland's culture was shabby and etiolated, and Clunis's that the Shetlanders had lost beauty, whatever that meant, were rhetorical and unhelpful. The squabble between Jimison and Olsen was a waste of time. Shetland and Faroe have different cultures, different languages, different histories. They are all worth our study and respect. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Brian. Some fascinating quotations there, and also some very salient points about respecting the difference and sort of approaching each other from a position of not a sort of subservient one or an overly romantic one. So I think that's very useful indeed. So I'm sure that we'll pick up on that in the discussion afterwards, unless anyone has a question for Brian at the moment. I would like just a list of those quotations sometimes, Brian. It would be great to have a chance to read them. Are you going to produce in a paper or something?
Well, not much more of a paper, but you're welcome to have them, yeah.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Oops.
Okay, right. Well, we're moving on to a slightly different, a very different discipline now, but with some of the same points I think will be brought up about the differences and some of the similarities between the island groups. So I'd like to invite Simon Clark to tell us about some of the archaeology.
Hello. Okay, so I'm going to be showing a slide, and I'm slightly in trepidation because what I'm going to present is far-reaching or very superficial, depending on your point of view. Okay, so what I'm going to try and suggest is that there are some quite interesting recurring themes within the study of Shetland's archaeology, and I'm particularly interested in themes of isolation and connection, which seem to recur for me. First thing to say is that Shetland is the first habitation by humans that we know about is from really a single site in the South Mainland, at a site called West Bow, and this is evidence for a hunter-gatherer community right at the end of the British Neolithic, sorry, British Mesolithic, so around about 4100 BCE. There are very probably many other sites in Shetland. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, as is often the case with archaeology. The most important thing it really shows us this site, apart from the fact that they are hunter-gatherers, is that it was possible at this time for people to have reached Shetland. We know very little about them beyond that. So they're probably arriving in something like a currach, a skin-covered boat. This is a modern recreation, obviously. This type of vessel could be significantly bigger than this, would be covered with cattle hide normally, but potentially you could make it from other types of animal skins as well. And this, I mean, it does show us circumstantially that people were able to get here. It's just possible that they arrived in dugout log canoes, but this is the more likely. This is widely regarded as the more likely way that people could have arrived in Shetland. They must have been extremely competent sailors to have actually reached Shetland in such vessels. It would have taken several days to have paddled. They wouldn't have had oarlocks at that time. They might have been able to raise a sail, but it would have been very much dependent on wind direction. They wouldn't have had much ability to steer in a sophisticated way using more complex sails probably at that time. What's extraordinary about what happens next is that Shetland is also very quickly settled by farmers. Around or shortly after 4000 BCE, we start seeing evidence for farming in Shetland. And in fact, this is one of the strange phenomena of the Neolithic in Britain, that pretty much all parts of Britain are colonized at around about the same time. Ireland a little earlier, but southern Britain and northern Britain are within a few hundred years of each other colonized. And in fact, Shetland and Orkney have the earliest known field boundaries relating to the British Neolithic anywhere in the country. So you might think that Britain would fill up in an orderly fashion from the south, from the direction that the farming colonists are coming from. But in actual fact, Shetland seems to have been colonized very, very quickly, which is a slightly surprising finding. And it seems to have filled up very completely. Places like Scord of Brewster by the end of the Neolithic have been very thoroughly exploited by arable agriculture. This would have been a landscape cultivated. The broken soil is indicated by cairns of clearance material, stone material that's been cleared from the hand-tilled fields. And this would never, even in the Neolithic, this would not have been a prime site for colonization. So it indicates that we are looking at quite a bit of pressure on the landscape to exploit all areas of Shetland. And in fact, Neolithic settlement is much more extensive than the later prehistoric settlement of the Iron Age and the Norse period. We do have very slight evidence for the Shetlanders themselves at this time. We've got a single kist which actually still contains contained human material. So this was disarticulated material in a stone box, essentially, discovered at the site of Sunbury Airport, under the control tower, or on the edge of the control tower. This material dates to the second half of the 4th millennium BCE, so it's fairly early within the Neolithic. Cultural parallels suggest links not with the nearest island group of Orkney, but actually with the Western Isles. That's typologically quite insecure piece of information, because the pottery is so simple and there's only so many ways you can make handmade pottery, I would argue. But nevertheless, you can make meaningful statements about this society at this time. Interestingly, the pattern of behavior within Shetland is a little bit different from what we know of the Western Isles and the west coast of Scotland. There is a very clean break between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, with people moving from an almost completely marine diet to one in the Neolithic, which is overwhelmingly terrestrially based. But isotopes in Shetland suggest a much higher level of dependence on marine resources. So there is some uncertainty about the relationship between incoming farmer groups and any pre-existing hunter-gatherer groups in Shetland, I would suggest. One thing we can say, though, is that they lived in the landscape in a much higher density. We would be talking about low thousands of people living in Shetland, rather than potentially only seasonal occupation and by very small numbers of people. Maybe not even 100 people living in Shetland in the Mesolithic period, and potentially only on a seasonal basis. That has implications for how community works. 100 people is not a viable breeding population. You would need to have communication with outside groups. By the Neolithic, you're looking at a population that could have been barely, admittedly, but could have been self-sustaining without outside genetic input. And that's significant potentially when we look at the next slide. So this is the site of one of Shetland's Neolithic axe factories, Uya of Borgs, in the North Mainland. And this is a fellsite quarry where they're mining a fine-grained, intrusive igneous rock, which is taken away as blocks or blanks to create polished stone axes, and these are honed into finished artifacts at the settlement sites. These are found all over Shetland from this site, but they are not found beyond Shetland. And that's regarded as different from other quarry sites across the British Neolithic. The Neolithic widely trades these sites, these types of objects. They are both practical tools for felling the forest that would originally have covered Shetland, but they are also, particularly the larger ones and the more carefully manufactured ones, prestige objects, many of which have never been used in anger. They are gifts that circulate as part of an exchange economy which is not economically driven, but is driven by social obligation. And these are not leaving Shetland. And so that has implications for the nature of contacts between Shetland and the rest of Britain. And that contrasts again with places like the Western Isles, where something like the Shulashanda axe is actually an import from Northern Ireland, from Antrim. Moving into the slightly later Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, we see another really interesting point of difference, perhaps, between Shetland and other places in Britain. There is virtually no beaker pottery in Britain. There is one piece from Ness of Gruting, which is regarded as beaker influenced, and there are a small number of artifacts like these quartz tanged arrowheads, which are regarded as beaker influenced as well. But it's quite likely that Shetland was relatively unaffected by the beaker migration, which begins at the end of the Neolithic and as we move into the Copper Age and the Bronze Age, around about the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. This is in southern Britain, this seems to be a very substantial population replacement. Recent genetic studies have suggested that something like 90% of the population was replaced at this time. There is a major regression in the use of cereal crops. It's the period in which we believe a pastoral economy is established across much of England and southern Scotland. What's going on in the Scottish Islands is much less certain. We haven't sampled widely enough for modern DNA studies to actually be certain. There is some recent work that's been in Orkney which suggests that very unusually the male lineages survive, but they are marrying into beaker lineages from elsewhere in Britain. That was based on a study just in Westring. We don't really know whether that's something that can be extended to the whole of Orkney, let alone whether it's a model that might also work for Shetland. But what we can say in material terms is that while the rest of mainland Britain is adopting circular domestic architecture, Shetland is persevering with a much older tradition of curvilinear non-circular architecture, such as the Nessagruting house and other structures. So really interesting questions about continuity and breaks in continuity that are open questions at the moment for Shetland. Having been a late adopter of circular architecture, Shetland is perhaps an early adopter of the massive Atlantic roundhouse, the Brochs and the Duns form. This is the Scatness excavation, and it's probably one of the earlier Broch constructions. These have not been investigated in enough instances really to say that this is a very early example or not. But it appears to have been founded around about 400 to 200 BC. And there is a general typological rule we can make, which is the thinner the walls of the Broch and the bigger the space in the interior, the earlier these structures are. Later on, the walls get thicker and the space in the interior gets smaller. So Musa, for example, is one of the very last to be built in all probability. Again, there are tantalizing points of difference and similarity with other island groups within Scotland. Shetland has wheelhouses quite commonly, which are most similar to the ones that we have in the Western Isles. Orkney doesn't really have this type. But the Broch village that we have at Scatness is reasonably closely paralleled by some of the Brochs in Orkney in terms of this nucleation of settlement around the Broch and within a larger defended enclosure. Potentially a very different ethic in terms of the style of these houses, though. The houses at Scatness are quite similar to the Broch. They are circular in form. They are monumental in scale, whereas the houses outside places like Gurness are pretty mean and clearly of a very different social class to the main house, the Broch itself. So potentially some very significant social differences between these different island groups. And as I say, we haven't really investigated extensively enough in Shetland to really know how much this is a model for Shetland more generally. We also get to an interesting point of departure when we look at the relationship between the Pictish population that follows on from the late Iron Age and the successor population in the Norse period. So this is again Scatness. This is one of the late Iron Age houses which continues in use into the Norse period, and in fact the Pictish bear is probably or had probably been an orthostat to one of these two piers. It's actually face down just between these two piers in this picture. The last floor that was inserted into this house seals a whole load of Viking period material, and it looks like this house has a secondary use in the Viking period as lower status accommodation and as a workshop. One of the things that we need to be very much aware of in archaeology is that continuity of material culture does not imply continuity of population. This is the opportunistic, potentially this is the opportunistic reuse of a building by a completely different group of people that are using it in very, very different ways. It's just a convenient building that's still standing when it's taken over in the Viking period. The main house, we believe, that's contemporary with this would have been a Viking style house. Unfortunately, that was probably one of the houses that was swept away when the airport access road was inserted in the 1970s. Okay, so a really interesting question about the nature of the relationship between the existing Iron Age population, which might have been as high as some people have suggested as high as 10,000 people, and the Viking period population. What exactly happens? Is it simply a cultural change? Do people, change their dress styles and their language, but essentially they're genetically the same, or is this a replacement people? And Brian Smith actually has argued very strongly that it is a population replacement, and I'm increasingly inclined to agree with him. We do see some telltale signs in Shetland which are quite suggestive. So, as with the Western Isles, we see the widespread replacement of Iron Age circular and curvilinear architecture with longhouses. But there are some other things which are slightly different. We see the introduction of steatite as the main type of vessel for cooking and for eating purposes and storage purposes. Pottery completely drops out of use in early Viking era Shetland, and that does potentially suggest not only a change in taste in terms of what people wanted on their tables, but also perhaps in technology, the ability to produce this material culture. We also see obviously a large-scale linguistic replacement. Almost all of the place names are Norse or later in Shetland today. Very few pre-Norse names surviving. And more recently, we've got the evidence of nuclear DNA, which is beginning to suggest that, in contrast to the Western Isles, we see roughly equal numbers of male and female settlers coming in from Norse regions. And that doesn't prove complete population replacement, but it does suggest something rather different from what's going on in the Western Isles, where it is predominantly male settlers that are coming in and taking local women as their wives or concubines. And that may well also have implications for the nature of language replacement as well. Children tend to learn the language of their mothers rather than their fathers. Finally, and as I did promise you this was pretty superficial, moving on to the modern era, we also see evidence for a very liminal nature of the Shetland existence, really. This is Scallowa Castle, built around 1600. And it's one of the last of the tower houses built in Scotland. This is really an invasive architectural form, and this is a period in which Shetland is coming out of the Scandinavian world and being legally subsumed within Britain or within Scotland at that time. It's the last part of Scotland to be annexed, the last to be acculturated into Scots society. Moving into a little later, we see Fort Charlotte on the right. This is an indication of some of the fears of the British establishment that Shetland is not securely part of Britain. The fort is built initially as a deterrent to Dutch annexation, and it's interesting that even in the early 20th century, we see Home Office officials commenting on, concerned about the political reliability of Shetlanders, that they seemed to be way too friendly with the German sailors that had come over. as part of a naval visit in 1905, I believe. So it's interesting that this kind of liminality of Shetland is a continuing feature. Shetland is clearly very different from the mainland of Britain, but I want to also emphasize that it's very particular in terms of its relationship relative to other island groups as well. They're all distinct. They need all to be taken as individual case studies, really. You shouldn't assume that they're going to follow a similar course. They clearly are subject to similar forces of isolation and connectivity in terms of the potential of sea transport, or the limitations of sea transport and isolation. But each case is very, very particular, and they're not necessarily in sync. So just to recap those recurring themes, Shetland is a community that is profoundly shaped by its environment, but also radically changes that environment. It shows contrasting patterns of alternating isolation and connectivity. We see surprising continuities, but also abrupt changes. And I think we shouldn't assume that, that Shetland is always an example of continuity. There are some quite sharp breaks in its history, rather more than we realized when I first came to Shetland 25 years ago. So, and I think that's maybe the last point just to emphasize is actually, since I came here, almost everything I initially learned about Shetland archaeology has turned out to be unsatisfactory and changing. That could be seen in quite a frustrating light, but it's actually, it's a reflection of huge improvements in dating evidence, in the introduction of scientific approaches like isotope analysis and DNA, and also just a lot more excavation and survey that's been carried out here and in other places. So that's everything I wanted to say. Hopefully that's given some people some pause for thought.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. It's always good to see opinions changing as the evidence is reassessed, and I think there's some real scope for some discussion with Brian and others about that. And I see we have to move on, but there is one question there in the chat from Vivica, which maybe you could address just at the moment. She's wondering what your opinion is of the suggestion that North settlers arrived to islands that had already been depopulated to an extent because of the climate crisis, and in the 6th century and twin volcanic outbreaks, the Fimbulvinter, as it's called in Scandinavia.
There's no doubt that the population was lower in the Pictish period than it had been at the height of the Middle Iron Age. I don't think there's much doubt about that. But there's a bias in the way archaeology has been targeted. So I think the sense that the Pictish culture is a diminished society is exaggerated by a less impressive architecture. There's actually a shift away from architecture as the main mechanism for expressing status towards other types of material culture that are archaeologically less easily detectable. And there's clearly a huge bias in what archaeologists have chosen to excavate. So we know far more about Brochs, which were only ever a minority of settlements in Shetland, than we do about other classes of settlement. And that says more about us than it does about the Iron Age, in actual fact.
Thank you very much indeed. Very succinctly put. Okay, we might come back to that later, but we'll move on just now, and it's John Goodland's turn. So hello, John. It'd be great to hear from you. It was good chatting to you yesterday, actually. Nice to see you in person.
No, thanks very much. I'm going to see, I have a few slides. I'll see if I can share them. Let's see. Just take a minute to load up. It's a little bit slow. Yeah, I want to talk about the cultural connection between Faroe and Shetland during the Codsmack era. The sea between our two island groups is now often seen as a barrier. but it was not always like this. In the Viking times, obviously the sea was the only way of travelling between the North Atlantic Islands. But more recently, during the 19th century, when Shetlanders fished for cod on the Faroe Bank, these seas between us were crossed thousands of times. For the Vikings and for the Shetland cod fishermen of the 19th century, this sea was really a bridge, a sea road, if you like, rather than a barrier. And I think that's an incredibly important concept to get in your mind. In our modern world where we fly everywhere or we go by car everywhere or by train, in the past, going by sea was very, very common. And the sea was quite rightly seen as a sea road rather than a barrier as such. Much of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm assuming you can see my screen now?
Yep, we can see your screen, but the it's not in display mode, your PowerPoint.
Okay, let's see. How's that?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay, so much of what I'm going to talk about today is contained in the research I did for my book, The Salt Roads, How Fish Made a Culture. And a large part of my book deals with the Faroese and Shetland connections. From the 1840s to 1908, upwards of 100 decked Shetland smacks crewed by upwards of 1,000 fishermen from Shetland caught cod around Faroe. They also caught cod at Rockall, southwest of Fulla, the so-called home grounds, and at Iceland, and occasionally at Greenland. But by far the most important fishing grounds were the Faroe Bank, and these were fished by Shetland smacks on a very regular basis. The smacks, as I say, were large decked vessels. Here is a painting of the William Martin, one of the most famous Shetland smacks, based in Scalloway. She was eventually sold to the Faroe Islands. These smacks fished with crews of 14 to 16 men on board, each fisherman armed with a hand line with 2 hooks, and they fished for the cod over the side. As the cod came on board, they were gutted, headed, split, and then salted into the holds. And these boats did trips of 2 to 3 months, so they were away a long time. When they returned to Shetland, the salted cod were laid out on the Shetland beaches to dry. And this is a picture which will be familiar to our Faroese colleagues as much as it is familiar to Shetlanders. The stone beaches around Shetland at the height of the Faroese, at the height of the cod fishing, would have been covered in salt cod. The cod was dried on the beaches for about 6 to 8 weeks, depending on weather conditions, and then was exported mostly to Spain and particularly to the Basque region. So for more than 60 years, 3 generations of Shetlanders fished around Faroe and became very well known to the Faroese. There are examples of many Shetland cod fishermen who knew Tórshavn and Faroe as well as the Faroese say, as the inside of their pockets. And yet these men had rarely been to Lerwick in their lives. So the connections were very real and very strong. And I think there's plenty of information about how much fish these cod smacks caught, what the exports were like, how much they earned, who the crews were. There's not so much research being done on the cultural links at this time. And as one or two speakers have already said, including Mark, the contribution that Dr. Jakob Jakobsen made to philology and to linguistic research in Shetland was enormous. But at the same time as Dr. Jakobsen and his sister were undertaking this incredible piece of academic work, academic research, upwards of 1,000 Shetland fishermen, ordinary people, people without a formal education, were fishing around and going into Faroese ports and speaking to Faroese people. So I want to have a look at two of the kind of cultural links that were established at this time. One, the language, and secondly, the really fascinating question of smuggling of brandy and tobacco back from Faroe to Shetland. The very first time I went to the Faroe Islands, it was, and I've been a regular visitor. I was at university when I went first, and I must have been to the Faroes now 12 or 14 times. And it was clear I was in a foreign country. I couldn't understand Faroese. And yet, when I listened to Faroese being spoken, every now and then there was a word or an expression or something which told me what the meanings were. And here's just a tiny number of examples just to illustrate. In Shetland, the Shetland word for a porpoise is nisik. In the Faroes, it's nuisa. We call a black guillemot a taisti. It's called the same in Faroe. Our name for a oyster catcher in Shetland is shalder, and in the Faroes, chalder. There's thousands more examples. And of course, the place names are almost identical. So while Dr. Jacobsen was undertaking his work into Shetland, as I say, Shetland cod fishermen were conversing with Faroese people about everyday things, not only when they came into port, but also on board the smacks. As Brian Smith has said, in the late 19th century, Shetlanders discovered herring and began to make a lot of money fishing for herring. The result was that the Shetland cod merchants found it difficult to find crews for their smacks. And for about 20 years, many Faroese fishermen were employed on Shetland smacks as crews. So for a couple of decades, you would have had the situation of a crew, perhaps half the crew Faroese and half the crew Shetlanders, fishing with a Shetland skipper. And not only, as Johannes Patterson said in that marvellous speech he gave in 1928, not only did the Faroese learn their fishing skills on board these Shetland smacks from the Shetlanders, but it's interesting to speculate about what language were these technological skills passed on. Most of the Faroese fishermen, I would guess, would have had very little English, and perhaps the use of English by the Shetlanders on board the cod smacks would have been pretty limited. They would, of course, have understood it and been able to speak it, but they would have conversed with each other in Shetland, and the Faroese would obviously have heard that. It appears to be the case that communication was not a problem, and they were able to make themselves understood to a surprising degree indeed. Oral history from both Faroe and Shetland attests to this degree of linguistic understanding. At a time when as Viveka was pointing out, when you compare languages, when the difference between Faroese and Shetland was not perhaps as great as it is today. So that's a really fascinating piece of, I think, potential future research, which Froskapaseta and Shetland University of Highlands and Islands students might be interested in having a look at. This cultural and linguistic connection between ordinary people doing fishing on board smacks around the Faroes at this time. The second thing I want to look at is this fascinating aspect of smuggling. When I grew up in Shetland as a small boy, I was brought up with stories of Faroe brandy. Some of my ancestors were cod fishermen at Faroe, and I was told about the Faroese, the Shetlanders bringing back brandy and tobacco from the Faroes. The brandy came in something called brandy pigs. These were large earthenware jars, possibly holding 3 gallons of brandy. And when I began to research my book, I was really disappointed to find that I could find no record in any of the Shetland archives as to what the scale of the smuggling had been. How much brandy, for example, had been taken to Shetland? Was it frequent? Was it just for domestic use, or was it larger? And it's perhaps not surprising, because smuggling is, of course, illegal. At this time, in the 19th century, the customs and excise duty in Shetland was exactly the same as in the rest of Britain, but in the Faroes, there were minimal customs and excise duties. So there's no evidence really in the Shetland archive as to the scale of the activity, other than the occasional cases where a Shetland cod fisherman was caught by the authorities and was either fined or sent to prison for 2 or 3 months. And in those court cases, there's some indication as to the quantities involved. So I was pretty much resigned to not knowing what these quantities would be like, or have any indication of that. But that was all to change. But 10 years ago, when I made a trip to Faroe on board the Swan, which is a restored herring smack, one of Shetland's herring boats, very similar to a cod smack in sail rig, but not as big. And the Swan may be very well known to our Faroese colleagues today. She's a regular visitor to the Faroes. She was there this summer. We made a trip, as I say, I made a trip with some friends. We had a very pleasant week sailing around Faroe, and quite by chance, on our way back to Shetland, we went in past Suðuroy to Faroe, where I met this lady, Anna Kirsten Thompson. We were just about to leave for Shetland to go back when we'd gone into the pub, which is a restaurant and pub in Faroe, in what had been the old Thompson merchant house. And Anna Kirsten Thompson came across and asked if we were from Shetland, and she told us that that she had also been brought up with stories of the Shetlanders buying brandy and tobacco from her great-grandfather, who ran the merchant store at the time. And I asked, I was immediately interested. Perhaps I thought here were some records of how big and how extensive the smuggling might have been. So I asked if these records were perhaps kept in an archive in Tórshavn or possibly in Copenhagen. And she just laughed and said, well, just come through next door. So we went through into a room next door to the bar, and there it has obviously been an old office where nothing had changed in the past 150 years. And there on the table were old ledgers. And as I flicked through these ledgers, I could see the names of the Shetlanders, from which vessels, from which cod smacks, how much brandy and tobacco they had bought, on what date, and how much they'd paid. We did, as I say, we were actually in a hurry to leave because it was a poor weather forecast. So we actually, I had to leave these records unread within an hour because the Swan was leaving. The skipper was keen to get back. But I came back 4 years later and did quite a bit of research in this archive. And my research confirmed beyond all doubt that the level of smuggling was huge. For example, the average wage of a cod fisherman in the 1860s, the average annual wage of a cod fisherman was around £18. And some of these Shetland cod fishermen were buying brandy for £21, £24. I think the largest purchase I found was one for £28. Huge quantities. Just imagine paying more than your annual salary for a commodity that was illegal. They were taking a huge chance. And I kind of was wondering, you know, how could these relatively poor fishermen manage to pay this kind of money? And then it caught my eye that the merchant in Faroe was giving the Shetland cod fishermen a full year's credit. So they paid for the brandy the following year. So it was a no-brainer, an incredible business opportunity to take back brandy to Shetland, to sell it at inflated prices at a profit, and then only pay for it the next year. So it was clear it was at a large scale. It was clear it was a large part of the Shetland economy. And this degree of trust that was built up between these Faroese merchants and the Shetland cod fishermen fascinated and continues to fascinate me. The Faroese merchants must have had enormous trust that the same Shetlanders would come back next year and would pay their debts in full. And this, of course, went on for about 60 years. I only investigated the Thomson Merchant House record, and to some extent, but there are, I believe, other merchant house records in the Faroe Islands. And here again, I think this would be an incredibly interesting piece of archival research for students from Froskapasæter or Shetland UHI to undertake, to look to perhaps get a better quantification than I'd been able to do as to the extent of the smuggling operation between the Shetland cod fishermen and the Faroese cod merchants. So an incredibly interesting period of Shetland Faroese connections. It is the connection that involved the greatest number of people, as I say, upwards of 1,000 cod fishermen, and some incredible cultural connections that were built up during that period that have been completely ignored or neglected in subsequent research. And I think there's a very rich seam to be examined. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the interesting research project idea as well. So we'll see if anyone wants to pick up on that. I see Christopher has said in the notes, presumably there are no customs records or custom ships operating at the time. Well, they might not have picked up on all the actual activities that were taking place. They were, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, there was no enforcement at all in the Faroe Islands because no laws were being broken in the Faroe Islands. This was simply a commercial purchase of brandy. But in the Shetland Islands, there were laws being broken. And the Customs and Excise authorities went to great pains to try and eliminate this smuggling. Brian, you might recollect, it was either James or John Gatherer, a very appropriate name for the man in charge of gathering customs and excise duties. John Gatherer came to Shetland full of enthusiasm to wipe out this appalling practice, but after 20 years wrote something like we just simply can't get any Shetlanders to give us any information on this whatsoever. So it was clear it was widespread within the community. There was no feeling within the community that people had to be reported. Clearly, most Shetlanders were benefiting in one way, either as sellers or buyers from cheap Faroese brandy. The customs officials did locate a large Royal Navy schooner in Lerwick to try and intercept these smacks coming back to Shetland. The smacks came back and launched small boats to take the brandy ashore in isolated places where it was buried and hidden until they made arrival into Lerwick. And this large schooner tried, but pretty much without success, to intercept the Shetland smacks. So there was a huge customs and excise attempt to wipe this out. I mentioned the very large fines for those few people who were caught and the prison sentences for several months, but they singularly failed to make an impact on this.
Thank you very much. Les is saying there one of his Shetland ancestors was arrested and fined £10 for smuggling, which he paid on the same day. So clearly a profitable business.
He clearly, Les, made a lot of money from selling brandy the previous year. And he was also very unusual because most of the Shetlanders that got the choice between paying and going to prison, most of them elected to go to prison and keep their money.
Sensible. Thank you very much, John. And now we're going to move to Jenny Murray, who is going to give us another archaeological and ecclesiastical talk. Hello, Jenny. Nice to see you.
Hi, now let me share my screen. Can you see that now?
Yes, lovely slide, but it's not in slideshow.
Oh, it is on mine, so maybe it's.
Sharing the wrong screen.
Simon says you might be sharing the wrong screen. How many screens have you got, Jenny?
Hang on a minute. I'm hoping I'm not sharing the wrong screen. Can you see that?
Well, it's the same one. So if you've got the presentation sort of notes on one side and
Hang on now. Will I try sharing again?
Aye, try again.
Okay, hang on. Give me 2 seconds. I'll open it again. Right. Share screen. No, does that? Are you seeing that?
Well, we're seeing, we see your cursor moving along saying slideshow.
I mean, it's shown on my screen, and it was when we did the practice run.
What do you got? If you go up to the little cursor at the top, the little logo, the play one, just above home.
Where am I going here?
The best thing is probably to close it down, or stop sharing, sorry, and then put it into slideshow, and then
Okay.
when you choose to share the screen, make sure that you are sharing the one that's in the slideshow version, not there'll be a second version that's in lecturer's notes version.
Oh. Oh, weird. Slideshow. Oh, it seems to be, I don't know. It just seems to not be behaving. But can you see something?
Well, if you share again.
Okay. I don't know why it's not working this time. Sorry about this. Shut that out. Faroe Symposium. Share screen. Entire screen. Now can you see anything?
Well, we can see. Yeah, we can see it. But
Yeah,
click on the second slide, and then we can see if it changes.
Okay.
Perfect. That's fine. Yes,
Okay,
just
let's just go like that, because as soon as I try to go into actual slideshow, it stopped.
That's absolutely fine.
So we'll go with this. Anyway, after all that, and I was just going to say that after listening to Simon's, once that we move into when the Norse settlers come, our archaeology is very similar, and our place names are like the small chapel sites within the circular enclosures and barnhus and things like that. So there's a lot of similarities in that sense between Orkney and Shetland. But as you can see, I'm Jenny Murray. My day job is I'm the curator that's responsible for archaeology at Shetland Museum, but I'm also in my second year of a PhD. Simon is actually one of my supervisors, and the title is A Saint in Stone, the significance of the materiality of the cult of saints is evidenced in the cult of St. Magnus the Martyr. And we know that the cult of St. Magnus travelled north to Faroes, to Iceland. But today I will just be looking at like the materiality of his culture in Shetland and Faroes, and how we remember him in the different communities, what we share, and so we'll go from there. And thank you to the organisers for allowing me to share my research. And every research journey starts with that spark of interest. And mine, as a curator, going to put on a display of portable altars. I took out this small, and it's at the left-hand side here, this small square portable altar. It's the top right-hand corner of a bigger altar table, stylistically dated to the 12th century in the type of carving. And the local geologist popped into the museum and said, well, that's not Shetland stone, which set us on a journey of looking for other red sandstone, this bright red, which was not normal in Shetland. And we found a capstone in the museum collection that's in the middle here that was from a towered church, a 12th century towered church in Burra. And you can see that we also have this bright red sandstone in the landscape in recycled churches, as seen here in the bell tower at Burra. So we know that there was this 3 12th century towered churches that were built in Shetland. None of them survive, unfortunately. They were all replaced in the closing decades of the 1700s with bigger churches. But this is, my friend Alan has made these what they might have looked like. But we do have records that says that the tower of St. Magnus in Tingwall was built of this bright red Arcadian sandstone. So to cut a long story short, we got some samples from all 3 sites of this red sandstone, and it all turned out to have been quarried. We were sent it to the British Geological Survey, and all 9 samples were Arcadian sandstone from the Hyde of Holland quarry in Kirkwall in Orkney. And it's the same sandstone that was built, that the St. Magnus Cathedral is built of in Orkney, from the same quarry site. And our research, we measured blocks in Shetland, and they very much matched the size of the blocks in Orkney. So we came to the conclusion that the tower churches in Shetland were probably built at the same time as the cathedral was being built in Orkney, and probably by this, maybe by the same stonemasons, and that this red sandstone was somehow symbolic to the cult of St. Magnus. Of course, the cathedral was built under the instruction of Earl Ronald Cally Colson in the honour of his uncle Earl Magnus Erlandson, who was murdered in Orkney in about 1116-17. Miracles began to happen, and at the place where Magnus fell. And to cut a long story short, he was canonized 20 years after his death. And so Ronald was trying to become Earl at that point. And so with the cult of his uncle came power. He was looking to the Shetlanders for support. And we know that there were Shetlanders travelling to Orkney for miracles. Is noted in the Orkney Saga. In fact, there are more Shetlanders recorded than any others. So the power, he needed the Shetlanders too. So was he building these towers to further, as a kind of a symbolic piece of the cathedral in Shetland? And the one piece of evidence that we did find that really did link that was this paskina on the left-hand side here. This would have been built into the wall. And it's made from red sandstone, Arcadian sandstone. And I looked at the 2 surviving piscinas in the cathedral in Orkney and found that they were exactly the same size. There's within 2 centimetres, and they're of the same style with that lip around the edge. And I mean, you could even suggest that the same stonemason was making this church furniture. So I started then my research journey looking at the materiality of the cult of St. Magnus and how he's remembered in all the island groups. Much has been written about the hagiography of Magnus, but what is his material legacy? And how did the people respond to that material culture? And how is he celebrated and remembered today? So I will compare Shetland and Orkney. Shetland and Faroe Islands. So I'll move to Shetland first. He's not remembered on his special day in April here in Shetland, but a sense of the churches. But we do have is place name evidence, and of course the churches. There's 3 churches dedicated to St. Magnus in Orkney, and they're all associated with his martyrdom. But in Shetland here, we have 8 dedications, but one of which is modern. And we have place names also. There's St. Magnus Bay that you can see here. There's a 16th century document that notes St. Magnus Isle, which we think may be Papa Stewart. And I think there's another, I need to ask Brian about this one, but I heard that there's another possible St. Magnus Sound down in Dunrosnas. St. Magnus was mentioned in the Ballad of Hildina here in Shetland, recorded in the 1770s. So in that sense, St. Magnus is still with us here today in Shetland. But as I said, we don't celebrate him on St. Magnus Day on the 16th of April. But I'm hoping to change that and have some kind of celebratory thing, and perhaps a St. Magnus Pilgrim's Walk from St. Magnus Church in Tingwell into the more modern church in Lerwick, so that we can remember him. Let's just quickly go on to the Faroe Islands. I was very lucky to visit Faroes in June and had a wonderful week visiting your church sites and also the artifacts in the National Collection and at Kirkebur. And what a collection it is. Your materiality is amazing. The Faroes has its cathedral. There's 2 cathedrals in the world dedicated to St. Magnus, one in Orkney, and here's the one in Faroes at Kirkebur. Although the medieval dedication is debatable and can be confirmed as it being from the time it was built. But it was built in Kirkebur, which is the ecclesiastical centre of the Faroes. The cathedral is one of 3 churches there. It's known as the Wall in the Faroes. There's the St. Olave's Parish Church, which was the small white one near the shore. And also there's the ruin of the Lickhouse, which may have been dedicated to the Irish St. Brendan. Sorry, I was standing there taking that photo, so I haven't got it in the image. But letters from the Archbishop of Nidaros during the late 13th and 14th century refer to St. Mary's Church, and we don't know if that's the cathedral or the parish church. And the late Simon Arg wrote widely about the Kirkebur settlement. It is a beautiful, fertile area. And Arg noted that the cathedral can be architecturally compared to the late 13th and early 14th century churches of Western Norway, that kind of longhouse construction. The argument that the cathedral was never finished has been a persistent discourse, but this has now been disputed over the last few decades by Kroch, Arg, and Kirsten Eliasson, who looked at the architecture, and they have all argued that it was completed, and I have to agree. Looking at the evidence of the material culture, we have first the golden cabinet, which survives on the east gable next to the large window. You can see it in the right-hand picture, and this is a close-up. It's a nicely carved piece of steatite, which would have been probably Norwegian or perhaps Shetland, we don't know. And it has the inscription around the edge. Here resides the following relics: a fragment of the cross of our Lord of the sacrificial lamb. Behold the Holy Virgin Mary, born from the blessed martyr Magnus, and the holy Thorlak's grave. So a mixture of relics, but including St. Magnus. The golden cabinet was removed in 1905, and inside the cabinet in the relic, you can see there's an alcove for the small light box to go into that's carved in the steatite block. And the relics are inside. When Daniel Brun investigated the relics, he noted he did not think they had been disturbed before, and they were still intact and wrapped in cloth. And stylistically, the golden cabinet is dated to around 1300 to 1350. We also have the consecration crosses, of which some are still in their original place, others are in the museum. And so, and I should have said, like, the cathedral is thought to have been built under the instruction of Bishop Erlander around the very closing decades of the 13th century, around into 1300. But you can't speak about Faroese church furniture without mentioning the Kirkebor pewines, which are just incredible. They were removed from St Olaf's Parish Church, the White Church, in 1874. They're a collection of 16 pewines and 2 lectern panels. And again, ARG suggested that they were recycled from the ornately carved stalls from the choir of the church. And they are in remarkable condition. They depict 11 of the 12 apostles, and there is one with the Virgin Mary meeting Elizabeth, and another with the Virgin Mary and child. On one of the pewines is a coat of arms believed to be that of King Eric of Pomerania and Queen Philippa, and date to around 1406 to 1442. So a century after the cathedral was built. But were they ever in St Magnus Cathedral and then possibly removed and installed into St Olaf's Church, maybe at the time of the Reformation, they are certainly wonderful carvings that would be fit for any cathedral. And I also want to thank my Faroese friend John Sigurd Hansen for alerting me to the tale of St Magnus' miracle at Kirkebor. St Magnus showed his power of miracles, and on a shipwrecked Icelander who had become insane, and he was dragged into St Magnus Cathedral by several men, and holy water in the name of St Magnus was sprinkled on him, and then he became as tame as a lamb. So in comparison, I think you've got some incredible church furniture here in Faroes, and you've got the relic. We have no idea whether Shetland would have had a relic, perhaps at St Magnus Church in Tingwell. But we had the red sandstone, which in some ways could be seen as symbolic, as part of the church of the cathedral in Orkney. And that might have been that, well, you had a piece of the church. And as my research has gone on, I've found it in other churches, which I'll not go into today, but it's other churches, even in Orkney, were sharing this red sandstone. So, and also I'll finish with saying that John Hansen said that there's a saying in Faroes that the bright nights start with the Magnus Mass on the 16th of April. So he's still very much in your psyche too, in Faroes. And I will just finish with a question. When I was looking at the artifacts, we came across this. Helgi at the museum thought that it could be the bottom part of a grinding stone, but when you look at the right-hand picture, it's actually concave. There was no signs of wear, and there's like niches at the side here, as if it had been placed into something. So I'm hoping some of our Faroese friends can enlighten me whether it could be ecclesiastical or agricultural. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny. Some really interesting thoughts to consider. The one about the stone being symbolic is very interesting, and also thank you for the pictures. There's wonderful images, and for linking us between Shetland and Faroes, which gives us a great place to continue from. But just before we do that, John has put in a question. Do you happen to know which St. Lawrence Kirk is called after?
No, I'm sorry, no.
Probably there's a very famous one. It was I just checked them up again, but
yeah, there was one
the
that
most widely venerated saints,
a gruesome, wasn't there?
as befits a true saint. Well, thank you very much. So that completes the Shetland side of things, and now we're going to move to the Faroe Islands, and our first speaker is Erling Isvoll. And Erling, it's great to see you. Please continue.
Yeah, hello, and thank you for having me in this meeting. I have been working on the Ployen's idea of modernizing Faroe Islands through establishing fisheries industry in the 1830s and 40s. and all the other governors at that time were also active in that effort. And in that story, I have been studying his travel to Shetland and the Shetland Society at the time. But that is not what I wanted to talk about today, because I wanted to go further back in history and try to I would try to. Where do I get?
If you look for the share button, it's down at the bottom.
Yeah. It doesn't just. It just. Where? Can you see it now?
We can, yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And in that research, it was very clear to me that the Shetland has been a model and a fine model for Faroese modernization thoughts, and my further research has shown that it is. I have stumbled across it several times earlier in the history of the Faroe Islands, and it's very obvious because Shetland is is in the way when we want to go to Europe, we have to go close to Shetland, and it becomes a role model in that sense. The earliest in modern times, if you know, count the Viking and Middle Ages, is this spinning wheel, which is in Faroese is called the Scottish spinning wheel, and it has become something of a national icon today. But its story comes from the end of the 17th century, and old sources say that it was brought to the Faroe Islands by two Shetlanders who were asked to come to the islands and introduce this and learn the Faroese to use this spinning wheel instead of their old-fashioned way of spinning. So here we have an information or exchange of knowledge and know-how and technology, and that is those three parts are what are recurring throughout the examples I will show you. But this spinning wheel is, of course, part of the peasant society, and when I talk about modernization, I talk about the efforts of moving on from the peasant society into a more commercial society or a capitalist society, and out of the peasant society, agricultural society, we could call it. And the agricultural society is full of prejudice against all new things, and all the sources are very concurring in that the resistance for renewing or for modernization is extremely high in the Faroes. We could not expect to see anything new happening from inside the Faroe Islands. But of course, we have British tax policy that impacts us, and our British tax policy in the later half of the 18th century had a big impact on the world. It started the American Revolution, but it was always also good for the Faroe Islands because it meant that this man is called Niels Rydberg. He's a big Danish merchant from the time, and he had an operation on the Isle of Man that he had to shut down because there were taxes put on his wares that he was importing to the Isle of Man and selling further on, or smuggling further on into England. So he asked the king if he could set up his operation in the Faroe Islands instead, and he got the permission to do that. And that meant from the 1767 he got his permission, and the next 20 years we had a very blooming period in the Faroe Islands, and the first really wave of modernization in our history. And that is the period I actually want to talk about, and maybe we could find something of this history in Shetland as well. The point of this whole operation is that ships from the West Indies are coming to Tórshavn with brandy and sugar and tobacco and other colonial wares, and there's also they're also sailing wine and brennivín from the southern countries of Europe. here to Tórshavn, and then small ships are coming from Scotland, and yeah, we have I have a list of places where they were coming from, and there's Lewis, and there's Hetland, and there's Orcades. We call Shetland Hetland in the Faroes, so it is also spelled so in this source I have, and other places from, I guess, the British coast. And these are the small ships from these places are coming to Tórshavn and buying this stuff from Rydberg, and then they are sailing back and doing pretty much what John was talking about. They were smuggling it in the middle of the night and probably finding some abandoned places where they could where nobody could see they were coming with this maybe not brandy, but wares that were highly taxed in Scotland. So on this picture, it's very clear that these ships are from England somewhere. I don't know. I'm not expert in British flags, but I think they are somehow referring to Britain. One of my ancestors called this time in a writing he had the time of the English people or the English folks, and modern historians have been very doubtful that what he meant by saying that it was the English time, because they thought that the merchant was Danish, so it must have been a Danish. He must have been confused and should have called it the Danish times. And that sums up a blind angle, I think, in the research we are doing, because we see mostly the connection between the Faroes and Denmark, and when that story doesn't fit, there must be something wrong, instead of us opening up and seeing, oh, maybe there was something other going on. Because at this time, before this time or and after, there were only maybe 2 or 3 merchant ships sailing to Tórshavn the whole year. And that was the only way of getting information and new things. So this trade with the ships coming from the West Indies and the southern of Europe, and all of these small ships coming from England to pick up the wares, was of course also a great information renewing of information also, and that is what I wanted to talk about, because even though these are smugglers, so there might be difficulty finding sources for it. But we have one of our greatest sources in Faroese history is this are these books written by Jens Christian Svabo in 1781 and 1782. It's about his travel. It's called A Report from a Travel in the Faroes, but it's a very good description of everything Faroese at the time, and it's our prime source for a lot of things from that time. And in this book, he mentions Shetland or Shetlanders several times, and that is that's interesting. He talks about. He says that in Shetland there are bird cliffs as well as as there are in the Faroes, and the Shetlanders are climbing them with as much courage and as much skills as the Faroes do, but they don't have this pole nets that is common in Faroese bird catching. And then he says that there was a Shetlander visiting the store, and this could be interesting to find out who this Shetlander was, and if there were more of them and why they were here, and so on. But this Shetlander he was inspired of seeing this pole net catching birds, so he wanted to find a Faroese bird catcher and take him back with him to Shetland, so he could learn the Shetlanders how to use this technology that they didn't have. So here we again have exchange of information and technology and know-how, and I don't know if there ever if there was a Faroese bird catcher in Shetland to learn them how to use this. So, but that could be interesting to study. On the other in the other way, Svabo is talking about the peat spade that was used in Shetland, which was much better than the Faroese because he could work nearly twice as fast cutting peat, because the spade was shaped in a form that made him able to cut and to dig the peat up of the ground in the same movement. That is the picture in the middle. While the Faroese peat spade to the right is shaped in a way that he first has to cut the peat loose, and then he can, in another movement, lift it up and put it up where it was, where it could be dried. I don't think this peat spade was ever introduced in the Faroes, but it's another example of new technology that could have been introduced and made life a little easier. And this story with the peat is a little bit interesting in connection with Ployen also, because a lot of his account of his travel to Shetland is actually about his travel to Scotland to find a peat pressing machine, which was supposed to make it easier to dry the peat by pressing it. And his thought was that if he could get a hold of this machine and get it to the Faroes, he could make efficient. He could make it more efficient to dry the peat, and thereby make people able to work something else instead of that. But he was disappointed. He didn't find the machine, or the machine was not as great as he thought it was. So but there are common subjects all through history, and the most common of all is this with fishery. And Svabo already here in the 1780 is talking about long line. He says that the ling is a rare species in the Faroes, whereas in the Shetland, ling is fished more often than cod is, and he presumes that it is that there is ling in the Faroese water or sea, but that it is the fishing method that makes the difference. And then he says that in Shetland, the ling is only fished with long line, whereas the Faroese just use the hand line. So his explanation about the difference between the neighboring islands is technological in this example, but exactly this with the long line is what happened 60 years, was the main result of Ployen's travel 60 years later. So it was not that the knowledge wasn't there, but the know-how and the technology didn't come until 60 years later. But the knowledge about fishing in Shetland was older. Yeah, I have found this letter by pure chance, but it makes, in essence, it says in a few sentences what I have tried to write in a whole thesis. And it's from a common Faroese man, I would say. I don't know much more about him than this letter, but he tries to get a farm for rent. He asked the official if he can rent a farm of the king's, one of the king's farms, and in it he has this sentence, which I have tried to translate. I have, with my humble means, tried to break free of the prison of prejudice by working in the coal mine in Suðuroy for a few years, and now I have sailed on Rübeck's ship to Copenhagen. On the way there, I was lucky to get the opportunity to look at Balder Sound in Hetland. And the white circle shows that even though the letter is in Danish, Hetland is spelled in Faroese. After hearing a lot about the economy in this most northerly province of the English realm, it was a pleasure for me to see how much Hetland resembles the Faroes, even though the economy in many ways is far worse in Faroe. And that is what that is the essence of it all. They want to get out of the old peasant society into a more modern society, and you can clearly see a model for the new society in Shetland, and it's primarily the economy that is inspiring for those who get the chance to visit Shetland or hear about it other ways. And then there is the population size. I was not sure if I should take this with me, but we have a fort here in Tórshavn, which this Commander Bourne began to construct in 1782. So it was a little funny to see that Fort Charlotte was from 1781. So they are from the same age, and that might be interesting to know why. But this commander also had a lot of interest in modernizing the country, and he wrote some comments to Svabo's book, and in it he has a long list of different modernizing subjects that he wanted to start. And one was to tame the sheep, one was to start fishing from ships, one was to plow the fields and use the scythe instead of knives and cultivate more land, and then manufacture or use mechanics in manufacturing and so on, and then build school also. And his conclusion was that if we do all these things, he was in no doubt that the Faroese population could be as big as it was in Shetland, where there were 20,000 people at that time. The Faroese Agricultural Society could only sustain 5,000, but the officials already in the 18th century saw that there was a possibility to increase the population of the Faroe Islands to what it was in Shetland if we just did as the Shetlanders did. That's it.
Thank you very much indeed, Erling, and thank you for that sort of interesting comment at the end, because that's clearly what people in Shetland are doing at the moment, looking to the Faroes and saying, we could do this. If we followed the Faroese way, then we could increase our population to the same size as the Faroes. So yeah, that's fascinating that the things were on the opposite way around at that point. There's some interesting questions there in the chat, well, or comments perhaps as well. So Shuan, who lives in Burra, she says she's seen a similar pole net improvised from a golf club on South Havre in Shetland. So maybe the idea managed to make its way across, even if not a Faroeman. And there was also, Keith says he's seen a pole like that in Heimei Museum on the Vestmannaeyjar in Iceland. So, yeah. What's the Faroese word for the peat?
Torf.
Yeah, torf for peat, but what about for the cutter, the knife?
Oh, hatchet.
Hatchet, okay, because it's a tusker here, so...
yeah, tusker, yeah. Tusker, take a listen.
Yeah, fascinating. So let's see... Oh, and there's a question also from Joe, who's very interested in fabrics and weaving, and she was wondering if I think you said introduce the loom. Does that mean there were no weavers in the Faroes before 1790, or were they using it?
Yeah, there probably were, but there was that has been an old-fashioned way of doing things with stones and things like that. This is probably a modern loom of the time. I'm not sure. But...
Thank you very much indeed, and we'll move on now to Yegvan, who's going to talk about the purism in language in the Faroes. So, Yegvan, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I will shortly say something about the purism, the linguistic purism, and especially about the consequences of the Faroese purism. First, thank you for the invitation to this online symposium. I am a professor at the Faroes in in Faroese at the Department of Faroese Language and Literature at the university. And my topic today is purism and the consequences of an active puristic language policy. It will be very short, and I have to leave the meeting when I am finished, so I'm sorry about that. The purpose of my presentation is to point out that purism has caused three, we can say, unintended things. One, increase of the Faroese lexicon during the last 130 years, with a lot of synonyms. Two, a big gap between the spoken and the written language. And three, Faroese language has got a kind of diglossic characteristics with this use of synonyms. I have some examples of this these word pairs, we could say. One Faroese word and one foreign word or import word. And now I'll take some examples of that. Tónleikur, musikkur, that means music. Støddfrøye and mathematics. Teldubrev, mailer, mail. Pincha, container. Trilla, helicopter. Brigte, variant. Løgregla, politi, police. Grundgiving, argument. And check, discussion. According to the purist idea, the lexicon shall be renewed, but not increased. The neologisms, or the Faroese word we can say, are not always able to replace the foreign words, especially in the spoken language. And the consequence of that is that the synonyms exist side by side. The distribution of the synonyms, the Faroese words are usually used in the formal language, especially in the written language. And the foreign words are mostly used in informal spoken language. The distribution is obvious when we compare words in a corpus of a spoken language and in the corpus of a written language. We can say that we have some positive consequences of the purism. The purism causes an increasing linguistic diversity. Now people can choose between different words with different connotations in different social contexts. We can, for example, choose a word musikkur in one context and tónleikur in another context. Such an option is a direct consequence of the purism. The synonyms get different connotations and are saved on different shelves in our mental lexicon. The difference between a spoken and a written variant of the language can be so big or great that it can be viewed as a kind of diglossia. And diglossia means two variants of a language used in different social contexts. In old terms called high variant and a low variant. And modern Faroese show a kind of diglossia, we can say. The high variant with Faroese neologisms used in formal situations, especially in the written language, as I said, and a low variant with foreign words used in informal context. That means in everyday language. A study of 8 accidental word pairs in 2 corpora, one spoken and one written corpus, shows that in the corpus of the spoken Faroese, the foreign words are more used than the Faroese counterparts in 5 instances of 8. 5 of 8. And in the written corpus, or the corpus of written language, the Faroese words are more used than the foreign counterparts in 7 instances of the same 8. I made a little study of the language used in subtitles in the Faroese television. And these subtitles in the Faroese television show a big gap between spoken and written language. In a news program on TV from October 2022, 3 persons were interviewed about inflation. The interviews lasted 9 minutes and 48 seconds. And in the subtitles, 36 foreign words were replaced by so-called Faroese words. And these 36 foreign words mostly were Danish loanwords in Faroese. That gives an exchange frequency on 3.8 word per minute. That means almost 4 words were replaced per minute. So my conclusion, the consequences of purism can be summarized as follows. The lexicon increases because the foreign words and the neologisms coexist at the same time. The foreign words do not appear automatically, even if Faroese words have been created and have come into use. And the result is a lot of synonyms. The purism enlarges the difference between spoken and written Faroese. The purism provides Faroese diglossic features with different codes for spoken and written Faroese. And this is the situation with purism for around 130 years. That's what I would say about this. And finally, I can say to connect it to the Shetland situation, that the first Faroese purist was Jakob Jakobsen, well known in Shetland. we say that he was the first Faroese purist, and he was inspired from the situation in Shetland at that time. After his travel to Shetland, he could see, or he could compare the Faroese language situation with the situation of the language in Shetland, and he could see, or he could see that the Faroese language could come into the same conditions as the Old Norse language in Shetland and Orkney. So we can say that there is a connection between the language situation in Shetland and the situation in the Faroe Islands. That was my words about this.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for making that connection at the end. It's a really fascinating subject, sort of, neologisms and things of that sort. And I just wondered, you mentioned some words there that some sounded a bit like Icelandic and some didn't. And I was wondering, how close are the neologisms in Faroese and Icelandic? Because they like to make up new words as well.
Yeah. In many instances, the Faroese words are inspired from Icelandic. In many I have for instance, tónleikur for music. It's an Icelandic loan, and the tyrla for helicopter is a loan from Icelandic, and lögregla for police is also a loan from Icelandic. And maybe no. So it's obvious that the Faroese purists have been inspired from the situation in Icelandic, and the inspiration is we can say natural, because the two languages, Icelandic and Faroese, are so similar in constructions and so we can say that we skip a Danish word and take an Icelandic instead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So it's a borrowing, but it's a pure borrowing, so it's okay somehow. And what I was wondering, who has the responsibility for deciding what new words are accepted into Faroese?
It is a language committee or a language council, we can say. A lot of these words, of the new words, have come from in old days from the language committee, but not. We can also get words from outside this committee. So it is people are interested in language, very interested in language, and they create, in some instances, they create the new words, and some of these words come into use.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, is there anyone else have a question for Jegvan? I know that Brian was interested in language purity. That was one of the reasons he wanted to join us today. So did you have your hand up there, Brian?
Yeah, I did. I had a wee anecdote. Quite a few years ago, Johan Henrik Poulsen told me that he was sitting on a bus in the Faroes and he tapped a woman on the shoulder in front of me and said, "Would you like a new Faroese word for body stocking?"
Yeah.
And she said, "Yeah, that would be good." And he said, "I propose bullald."
Yeah, that's a good story. Yeah. Not all these new words come to use. Bullald is one of the words that not have come through, we can say. So most people say today body stock or body stocker. Yeah, yeah.
Can you tell me what the significance of the termination ALD is in Johan Hendrik's proposal? I thought that in Scandinavian language, ALD implied action of some kind.
I don't understand your question, sorry.
I'm thinking about the termination of the word bullald in...
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that that termination usually implied action, but I can't see, you know, how that might apply to that proposed word in particular.
Yeah, if I understand your question, the meaning of bull, the first part of the word, is body. It's body, and the last part of the word is on what's called álasla, derivation. Alt can be a derivation in Faroese. So the first part of the word is body. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
I enjoyed that very much. Right, well, we have 15 minutes if we want to use it fruitfully to have a chat amongst ourselves about having heard people's wonderful talks and learned so much about possible ideas of taking this forward, of where people would like to collaborate with each other, or if there are new research topics and ideas that occur to people, having been inspired by today. And I see Simon's got his hand up.
Yeah, just going back to this concept of the language committee in Faroe, is that something that has enjoyed royal patronage or official patronage from outside Faroe, or is regional identity of that type kind of suppressed and discouraged by the official authorities? This does seem to sort of strike at the root of regionalism and of local identity as distinct from Denmark or from Scotland or whatever.
I think Jekvan's had to go, Simon. But I think the idea of a language committee is a bit alien to British people as a concept.
It sort of is. I had a meet years ago when I was meeting with Donna Heddle about setting up the cultural studies program. There was a suggestion that what Shetland and Orcadian dialect needed was some standardization so that they could agree on what the correct speaking of Orcadian or Shetlandic was. And it did seem a bit odd at that time that you should be trying to impose standardization within a region, but encouraging separation from the rest of the nation.
Well, I think Vivica's got her hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the context of the Danish situation, there is a similar committee in Greenland, a very large body, in fact, and they produce a lot of material. And in the context of the continental Scandinavian 3 Nordic countries, including Finland, Norway, and Sweden. The Sami body, there's a pan body. There are very many Sami languages, but they have a big body that have these kinds of committees, and also Elfdalian has a language committee like that. So it's really quite common in the world. It's very common, and you'll have standard languages that have language committees. French is an example. German is another example. So it is really quite common in the world.
We're just a bit of an outlier in the English-speaking world. and John, you've got your hand up. And your mute's on.
Sorry. Yeah, just a more general point, looking to the future. You know, I've just absolutely enjoyed listening to all the speakers. I think everybody, it was just fascinating, and clearly there is potential for future work between the two institutions. And I just wanted to make the general point that in Shetland we are, you know, our geography and to some extent our history gives us a unique opportunity to explore these links with places like Faroe and Norway. But we are bedeviled in Shetland by our current cultural, current economic and current political situation, where we look to the south for everything. And really as a community, it would do ourselves the world of good economically, culturally and politically if we were looking north and east. So I'm not suggesting for a minute we stop looking south, but let's not just look with one eye and be blinkered. Let's look at other places too. And I think this cooperation with Faroes could be part of that.
Indeed. Well, that's what we're doing just now, isn't it? We're being proactive and changing our perspective. But yes, indeed, excellent points. Personally, I would like to be involved in some more research connected. What Erling was saying about looking for historical connections before the 19th century. I think that's an interesting. I know the sources are not great, but nonetheless, Erling, you presented some very interesting ones there that I would like to definitely follow up.
Yeah, there are definitely more sources. These are just things that I stumbled upon when researching for other things. So.
Yeah, I'll certainly keep in touch with you about that.
Yeah, if we make something coordinated, we will find more.
Yeah, absolutely. And Faroes, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to echo what John said also, that I think it's been a very interesting seminar. I really enjoyed listening to your presentations, and I think, yeah, absolutely. I think we should continue with this and try to develop and strengthen our collaboration. And it's also interesting to hear about the different links, even if we there's a lack of maybe sources and there is a lack of research. Still, I think just through these hours and through these presentations, there were many interesting connections that I had not thought that much about, or less than the historians at least.
Thank you very much.
And maybe just one, can I just say one more thing?
Please do.
I think, of course, the language question is a huge area. I'm not a language specialist myself, but Faroese language and the Faroese language policy is it's a huge complex topic here. There's no day without discussions and debate and strongly emotional expressions in media about the language, about new words, about old words, about Danish words. But it's also very much about power and identity politics and it's changing all the time. And it's very related also to the political climate. So the language committee is by some people called the language police. And there is fierce opposition, both from different groups and from different islands, and people who oppose their policy. So it's a very dynamic and complex discussion about the Faroese language, which is very interesting, also from an anthropological perspective.
It is indeed, and I think Vivica's experienced some sort of similar things here in Shetland. There are sort of gatekeepers, perhaps, for Shetland that have to be kept on board. So, but she's smiling. Maybe move on from that. Yeah. Okay. Well, the one bit we didn't cover today, and I think would be great in future, and something that is really close to my heart, is folklore and folk tradition. So that's a topic that I might say something about at a later one of these events. But that is something that has always interested me, and the connections, the sort of survivals of pieces of folklore in Shetland, which have direct comparisons in the Faroe Islands, are really interesting, and there's still more work to be done in that particular field. Sometimes there is research that's been done, but it's often in, say, Norwegian or Danish or Swedish or something like that, and is not available to a wider audience. So that would be something to explore. And Keith put in the text to explore an exhibition exchange between artists. Yes, absolutely. That would be something to definitely follow up on. Perhaps we can talk about that again at a later symposium. So I think, unless anyone has, I think these are legacy hands, perhaps. Are they legacy hands that people have put up, or somebody you still want to say something? Vivica, is it?
There was a small comment on the note of folklore that is actually a bit like place names, very, very resilient, so that we have in the contact situations in the former plantation societies in the Caribbean and in the Eastern US, we have the Aunt Nancy stories. So Aunt Nancy stories, which actually go back to the original Anansi stories of West Africa. So the core of the story is the same. It's just been reanalyzed to suit the new contact language. It's quite
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are similar sort of examples here, and that's the sort of thing that I would like to take further. Right. Well, I think we can maybe start rounding things off now. I'd like to thank everyone for a wonderful, rich, illuminating, and really quite exciting experience, and for sharing your research and providing us with so much food for thought. There's so many different avenues there. The mind is sort of popping at the moment. I think we've got plenty to take away and consider. Let's deepen our research connections. And I'd just like to remind everyone that the next symposium is already organised and will be on the 3rd of November. And we will have some fascinating talks then as well. The focus is a little bit different. There will be some traditional material, but there'll also be some research into politics, fisheries, education and migration as well. So we're taking a slightly more contemporary tack at that event, but it'd be great to see everyone back at the next one. And also, we didn't really engage with how we were actually going to do networking and research in future. So maybe have a think about that between now and then, and we might have the chance to revisit that on the 3rd of November. But wonderful stuff. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you in future.